the topic of games and the future of culture. And I think none of these folks actually need an introduction, but I'm just going to do an introduction for everybody up front here. Noah Wardrip-Fruin is an associate professor of computer science. He's got his own fan section. He co-directs the Expressive Intelligence Studio and also directs the Playable Media Group in our Digital Arts and New Media MFA program. Noah's research areas include new models of storytelling in games, how games express ideas through play, and how games can help broaden understanding of the power of computation. He's authored and co-edited several books on games and digital media. His collaborative playable media projects have been presented by the Guggenheim Museum, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the New Museum of Contemporary Art, Cranert Art Museum, and the Hammer Museum. And he's also a board member of the directors of the Electronic Literature Organization. And today, what I hope we can talk about is really culture writ large, because we've had art as culture in a variety of presentations beforehand. We've seen several images from Renaissance Italy, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel and things like that. We've seen two presentations that had Edward Muybridge in it as well. Not that I have anything against Muybridge. There's a lovely show up at SF MoMA right now on his work. But it's been, you know, that's a kind of conservative notion of art, and it's also a conservative notion of culture, which includes both high and low culture. So I just thought maybe to start things, thoughts off, I'd quote Robin from her website where she says, "Games are often considered crude, different from other art forms, but in just over 40 years, they've changed the way we think about computers, theater, television, and film. They redefine how we consume and produce entertainment. To expand their expressive capabilities, we must solve some non-trivial problems." So I thought Robin's word has a nice way of getting us launched into a more expansive field of culture. So I'm going to hand over.
I'm Noah Wardrip-Fruin from UC Santa Cruz. And apparently I have a small following in these things. So there are a lot of things that we could mean by culture. For my talk today, I mean that culture is what we say to each other and who says it. And I think we can take it as a given, maybe particularly in this room, that games are becoming a really important way that we say things to each other, right? Maybe they're the most important emerging form for this century, the way the moving image was for the previous century. And I think that makes a set of questions really pressing. So one of the questions we've been talking about here today is, how do games mean? This is something we've been talking about, I think, quite a bit for the last few years. I think also there's the question of what can games mean? And then also the question of who gets to play what they mean. And I want to talk about all three of those things in 15 minutes, so none of them for very long. Let's start out with the question about meaning. So for those of you who were at the Game Developers Conference this year, you may have heard Clint Hawking's talk, which was an interesting one about games and meaning. And one of the things he talked about was a particular game of Go that happened in the pre-war period, but then was novelized in the post-war period in Japan, and could be interpreted to mean something about big changes that were happening in the culture at that time. And then if you saw Frank Lance's talk, it actually connects to the talk that Rod Humble gave just a few minutes ago, particularly in talking about poker. And what it had to say about poker was to connect it to people like John von Neumann, who were instrumental in creating formal game theory, and about how that game theory contributed to things like the idea of mutually assured destruction, and how mutually assured destruction could arguably have helped prevent that nuclear war that Rod and I both grew up thinking was perhaps inevitable. And so one argument you could make for the meaning of poker is that it should be interpreted as having saved the world, right? I think that that's an interesting thing thing to think about. But I'm also interested in questions like this. Like, what does this mean? Oh, and where is the sound? And I'm also interested in questions like, what does this mean? Right, so maybe it's obvious, right? It means one thing runs into another, right? But I think we actually don't entirely agree yet on the answer to the question, how does it mean that? Right? So we know it means differently than this, right? It doesn't mean the same way a painting of, Super Mario Brothers would mean. And I think we also agree it doesn't mean the same way as this, right? It doesn't mean the same way that a movie of Super Mario Brothers means, or even the video clips that are embedded in my slideshow mean, right? It means in a different way, right? It means somehow here, right? It means in player experience. And part of what that player experience is about the operations of the game being able to happen over and over and over, right? That's what makes the virtual world seem real. And I would say that this is as basic to the way that games produce meaning as sequencing shots is to how films produce meaning, right? So if we're going to understand this, how do games make worlds that feel present? How is that meaning created for us? Right? There's something that produces the player experience, and part of it is a presentation of the game state. But part of it is also a set of computational processes, right? So we can have the experience of virtual objects being able to touch when we're playing a platformer, not just because we have a presentation of the game state, which represents meaning a lot like a movie does, but because we have an underlying computational process that supports it. And these are operational logics, right? These sort of fundamental units of meaning. So operational logics combine a communicative goal, right? A goal like virtual objects can touch, with an abstract process, something like when two coordinate spaces overlap, do something. And that supports an ongoing representation of perhaps a fictional or real world, or just a presentation of an abstract game space, and an ongoing player experience. On some level, this is not news, right? We know many logics already. The one I've been talking about is collision detection. We talk about it all the time. We have different algorithms for doing it in different contexts. We see it in Mario, we see it in Call of Duty. There are also ones like navigation, right? We see it in Pac-Man, we see it in Flower. There are things like physics, we see it in Pong, we see it in Angry Birds. Video game mechanics are built on a foundation of operational logics like these. And so, for example, we can look at the core shooting mechanic in first-person and third-person shooters and say that's built on collision detection and navigation. But game genres that look very different, right? Different mechanics, like the core jumping mechanic in platformers, is built on collision detection, navigation, and physics. Or again, games that look quite different, Wii Tennis, Wii Bowling, they're built on collision detection and physics. And I don't think there's going to be any argument in this room about the idea that game mechanics define the fundamental space of player action and game response. And so a thing that follows from that, from the fact that game mechanics do that and they are built on a foundation of operational logics, is that games can be about the things for which we have operational logics, right? And those aren't just things about physical objects, right? So we can have games that are about things like pattern matching, right? We can pattern match in Guitar Hero, we can pattern match in Fahrenheit/Indigo Prophecy. Right? We have things, for example, like the progression of statistics or technology trees in things like Mass Effect or StarCraft. We have resource allocation and transformation in things like Oregon Trail or The Sims. And of course, we can theme the mechanics to create new meanings, at least up to a point, right? So we know a lot about how to make games about abstract objects like Tetris. And we can definitely theme them to represent different things. So for example, Raph Koster in Theory of Fun writes about how you could theme Tetris to be about an ideology, particularly an ideology that treats humans as objects. And instead of stacking abstract blocks, you could be stacking bodies in a gas chamber, right? It's sort of horrifying. And then someone actually went and made the game, which is maybe even more horrifying, right? But you can't take Tetris and theme it to be about an ideology that treats human beings as humans, right? There's no way to take this game about objects and say, now make it about human rights, right? That is not something that we can accomplish through theming. So I'd say we have a vast space of possibilities with all the logics and all the mechanics they support that we already have well established, but we keep trying for more, and I think it's good that we keep trying for more. And what I'd say we do over and over again is that when there's no strong operational logic, we start out by trying to explore ad hoc solutions. So imagine, if you will, what we would do if we were trying to have an ad hoc solution to economics, right? We might say, okay, if you invest in gold only, turn to page 10. If you invest in oil only, turn to page 21. If you invest in Vespine gas only, turn to page 32. Work farming only, 43. Gold and oil, 54, gold and gas, this, gold and warg, gold, oil, and gas, right, and so on, right? What we would do is we'd define every possible state and every possible transition between every possible state, and we would hand author each of those things, and what we would end up with is something that took a long time to author, that was really bug-prone, and still didn't give players the sense that they were actually interacting with as many options as they would have in an economic system. And that kind of ad hoc position is where we are today with things like emotional relationships, beliefs about the world, narrative progression, and so on. If you look at, like, I love BioWare games. I actually spend many, many hours playing them. They're not the only role-playing games I love, right? But if you look at the conversation editor from a BioWare game, what you see is every single state and every single transition between every possible state being hand specified, right? We're in exactly that kind of ad hoc position. And so it's no wonder that we get things like this, right? You know, we have a quest to show Rex to the doctor. We bring Rex to the doctor. We keep trying to talk to the doctor, and we can't, right? We are in the middle of a really complex quest. We go into our locker, we get out our armor, we put on different armor, and then for some reason, that completes the quest, right? You know, I don't want to pick on Fallout 3 in particular, right? It's a game for which I have some fondness. And actually, games that have more interesting quest bugs are very hard to show in like a 10-second movie. But I do want to point out that this is sort of an inevitable consequence of the way that we treat this subject. So I would argue that we need to invent the future so that games can be about more things, and particularly the things that matter most to people, right? And I would say that, you know, maybe this is a Coles to Newcastle kind of message in this room, right? That part of what the symposium is about is that there's a collection of people in universities and in industry, in big companies and small, who actually are hard at work trying to invent ways for games to be about more things. And I'm really excited about that. But I also am left with a question. And that question is sort of, you know, who are the people that we're talking about, right? That sort of final question I signposted at the beginning, right? Who gets to play what they mean? So obviously, you know, people in the game industry have invented new logics, have expanded logics, are, you know, trying to push the boundaries as we speak. People in universities have invented new logics, new ways of using logics, are trying to invent new logics as we speak. And these two groups have something in common, right? What they have in common is that they have a lot of experience specifying novel processes and then turning those novel processes into executable computational code, right? I think that's great. But I'm also really interested in people like this, right? And I have the question, you know, how do people like this become people who can specify novel computational processes? And part of the reason I have that question is because this is what my introduction to computer science class looked like, right? If you are fascinated with sorting things until they are in order, this is a great class for you. And I would have immediately stopped pursuing computer science had this been my first exposure to the subject, as it is for many people. I happen to be one of those sort of, kids who in the 1970s was exposed to Logo in my elementary school. And so I was like, oh, no. Like, this may be about sorting, but I know there's like a deep mathematical beauty hidden in here somewhere. And if I can just get through this class, right? And so, that's how I ended up being here. And I guess on some level, I'm really excited that now we are introducing people to computer science through game making, right? So we have tools like Game Maker that are in some ways taking the place of Logo, right? They're becoming the first place where people get exposed to computer science concepts. They begin to think of computer science as a way of making games that broadens the group of people who might be interested, and particularly it selects for the people who really like 2D platformers and shooting games. Which, again, is for good and for ill, right? I think we actually want to attract people who would be interested in a different kind of game as well. And so that leaves the question sort of, what is the alternative? So here's a video from a collaborative project with people at Santa Cruz, at ETR Associates, and at Microsoft, where we're just thinking about, with actually a number of advisors who I think are in this room, right? We're just thinking about, what if that very first introduction to computer science actually involved building on game mechanics that involved things like conversations and changing relationships? What if people thought that's what like a baseline computer science experience is, as opposed to sorting things? And we're not just trying to extend the tools. We're also going out and working directly with kids in middle schools, letting them try things out, seeing what sort of feedback they give us to what we've built so far, trying to draw them out about the kinds of games that are impossible to build that they would like to imagine building. And then we're basically taking the existing kind of robot programming inspired model of Kodu, and we're adding things to it like relationships and categories, and different strengths with which you can feel different kinds of relationships. And we're really trying to provide underlying computational support for a system in which saying things could matter, in which it could be a game mechanic, but also something that can be altered, right? Probably it's obvious what I'm saying here, but let me just be even more obvious, because I think that's a nice way to hopefully get some provocative questions asked, right? I'm interested in games that are built on a foundation of new operational logics. And I think we need to put them not just into our experimental university and industry games, we need to put them into the very first things that people experience. And I think that those tools then can actually embody a broader vision of what games can be and of what computer science can be. And then I think we can hopefully get broader participation. We don't just get the people who are interested in sorting. We don't just get the people who are interested in shooting. We get people who are interested in more things. And it's not me, and it's not anyone in this room who I think is actually going to create the new operational logics that really vastly broaden what games can be and how they can mean. I think it's those people who are now in middle school or earlier, who are going to feed into the creation of the new operational logics that will create the future of games. So from my point of view, the future of games is what we can say to each other and who can say it, and I want that to be as broad as possible. Thank you.